All right, welcome to another deep dive. This time we're heading back to the early 1800s to check out the Congress of Vienna.
Yeah, it's a really key moment in European history.
We've got some excerpts from, let's see, a Chinese language document, History of Western Diplomacy, I believe.
Yeah, chapter 2.
Right, chapter 2 goes deep into this Congress, so, what we want to do today is really understand its significance.
Absolutely. Who are the major players? What decisions did they make? And, how did it all shake out for Europe and really the world?
Exactly. Europe had just come out of the Napoleonic Wars. It was like hitting a giant reset button. But as you said, it wasn't a clean reset.
No, not at all. It's fascinating because it was like trying to put Humpty Dumpty back together again after a huge fall. All the kings and queens are scrambling to figure out what the heck happened.
Well, let's rewind a bit first. For years, Napoleon was like this unstoppable force, like a hurricane sweeping across Europe. Why was his success so disruptive?
Well, it wasn't just the conquests themselves. Napoleon brought the French Revolution with him wherever he went.
Ah, those revolutionary ideas, liberty, equality.
Precisely. And, well, those ideas were terrifying to the other European powers, especially the monarchies.
Yeah.
They saw Napoleon as this agent of change, and not the kind they were interested in.
They must have been petrified. Those changes threatened their power, their whole way of life.
Absolutely. I mean, imagine you're a king, and suddenly this upstart general is spreading ideas about democracy and popular sovereignty. Not a good look for the monarchy.
So it's almost like Napoleon was exporting a revolution, and that really freaked everyone out.
Yeah, exactly. And that fear, that's what drove everyone to form alliances against France. You had Britain, Austria, Prussia, all teaming up to try and contain Napoleon.
And of course, they eventually succeeded. But then what? You got this power vacuum. What happens next?
That's where the Congress of Vienna comes in. It was a massive gathering of diplomats and leaders, all trying to figure out what a post-Napoleonic Europe would look like.
A new world order, so to speak.
Yeah, a new world order. But there was one major problem. Nobody could agree on what that new order should be.
So you've got all these different players with their own agendas. Let's start with Austria. They seemed pretty keen on restoring things to how they were before Napoleon.
Oh, absolutely. Austria, under Metternich, they were all about legitimacy and tradition. They wanted to go back to the good old days, restore the monarchs, and rewind the clock on all that revolutionary fervor.
Sort of like hitting curl plus Z on the whole Napoleonic era.
Yeah, exactly. Back to business as usual. But of course, it wasn't that simple. You had other players like Prussia who were, let's say, a bit more ambitious.
They were on the winning side, right? So they were probably feeling pretty confident.
Oh, yeah. Prussia, led by King Frederick William III, they saw an opportunity to expand their power. They had their eyes on some prime real estate, taking chunks of Saxony and strengthening their position in the German Confederation.
Prussia's expansion seems pretty bold, especially considering they were on the winning side. Was there any pushback from the other powers about their ambitions?
Oh, tons. Austria, especially Metternich, he was wary. They were all about, remember, restoring that pre-Napoleonic balance of power. That delicate equilibrium that kept Europe relatively stable for, centuries.
So Austria was like, hold on, Prussia, let's not get ahead of ourselves here.
Exactly. They saw Prussia's growing power as a direct threat to that balance. But Prussia wasn't the only one with their eyes on expansion.
Right, Russia. I mean, they had just defeated Napoleon. They must have been feeling pretty invincible.
Oh, yeah. Tsar Alexander I, he wanted to solidify Russia's influence. And of course, he had his sights set on Poland.
Ah, Poland. Always a bit of a geopolitical hot potato.
Yeah, it was strategically important, and Russia saw it as their rightful sphere of influence.
Yeah.
So you've got Austria trying to cling to the past, Prussia and Russia looking to expand their influence. What about Britain? They were a major player in defeating Napoleon, but what were their interests?
Right, Britain. They were always a bit of a wild card. Their interests were a bit different, weren't they?
Very different. Britain, being an island nation, they were primarily concerned with maintaining a balance of power on the continent.
I guess it makes sense. Keep everyone else in check.
Yeah, they didn't want any single power dominating Europe. Think about it. A dominant power could threaten their security, their trade routes, disrupt that delicate balance.
Right. Keep everyone in check makes a lot of sense for a nation that relied so heavily on sea power and trade. But here's what I'm curious about. France. They were the defeated nation, the ones who started this whole mess. How did they even get a seat at the table, let alone have any say in the outcome?
That's one of the most fascinating parts of this whole story. France Despite being on the losing side, they managed to play a surprisingly influential role.
Really? How did they pull that off?
Well, largely thanks to their representative Talleyrand. He was, let's just say, he was a master diplomat.
Shrewd, cunning.
All of the above. He exploited the divisions between the other powers. He played them off against each other. And surprisingly, managed to secure some pretty favorable terms for France.
Wow. Talk about turning defeat into a strategic opportunity. So with all these conflicting interests, what were some of the biggest issues on the table at the Congress? I mean, it must have been pretty tense at times.
Oh, absolutely. There were two major flashpoints, the Polish question and the Saxon question.
The Polish question, right? Poland had been divided and ruled by its neighbors for a while.
Yeah, for decades. So the Congress had to decide Poland's fate. You can imagine that created a lot of tension.
Yeah.
Especially between Russia, who wanted control, and, well, everyone else who was wary of Russia getting even more powerful.
A recipe for conflict, for sure.
Yeah.
And the Saxon question, what was that all about?
Well, that was all about Prussia's desire for expansion. Remember how they were eyeing Saxony?
Right. They wanted to absorb that whole area.
Exactly. But of course, Austria saw this as a direct threat. They weren't about to just let Prussia waltz in and gobble up Saxony without a fight. Things got so heated that war almost broke out.
Wow. So how did they manage to avoid a war? It sounds like everyone was ready to throw down.
Well, compromise, ultimately. On the Polish question, they eventually agreed to make Poland a kingdom, but ruled by the Russian Tsar. But they gave Poland some degree of autonomy. Sort of a consolation prize, I guess.
A kingdom in name, but not in practice. And what about Saxony? Did Prussia get what it wanted?
Well, they got part of it, not all of it, but enough to satisfy their ambitions somewhat. Austria got some concessions too, so it's a delicate balancing act.
A compromise to avoid a bigger conflict.
Exactly. And remember, these were just two of the many issues they had to grapple with.
It sounds like they were constantly walking a tightrope, trying to balance everyone's desires and keep the whole thing from falling apart. Were there any guiding principles that helped them through this? Or was it just a free-for-all?
No, they did have some guiding principles. 3, to be exact. Legitimacy, compensation, and of course the balance of power.
Okay, legitimacy. So I'm guessing that means putting those monarchs back on their thrones. Turning back the clock.
You got it. Restoring the old dynastic order. The Bourbons were back in France and Spain. The idea was to return to a system that, well, they believed had brought stability in the past. If it ain't broke, don't fix it, kind of thinking.
It seems like Austria would have been big on that, right? With their desire to go back to the old ways?
Oh, absolutely. But, here's the thing. While this might seem like a victory for Austria and those who wanted to turn back the clock, it might have actually made things less stable in the long run.
How so?
Well, by clinging to the old order, ignoring those calls for more representative government, they were essentially bottling up those forces of change, making them more likely to erupt later on.
Ah, so trying to restore stability might have actually made things less stable in the long run. Interesting. Okay, what about compensation? Who is being compensated and for what?
Well, those who fought against Napoleon, particularly the victors, they were rewarded with territory. Prussia getting parts of Saxony, the Rhineland, Austria getting territory in Italy. It was like a reward for their loyalty and a way to strengthen them against future threats.
Almost like they were using territory as currency to buy loyalty and create buffers against future conflict.
Exactly. And finally, you have the balance of power. And I think it's pretty clear that they were obsessed with this idea.
Preventing any one nation from becoming too dominant. Like a big game of Risk, but with real countries.
Yeah, exactly. They were meticulously redrawing the map of Europe, adjusting borders, creating buffer states, all in an attempt to maintain this delicate balance. They didn't want another Napoleon situation.
They were playing 3D chess with entire countries, but then, of course, Napoleon did come back, he escaped from Elba, and everything got thrown into chaos again.
Yes, the 100 Days War. Napoleon's escape really threw a wrench in the works. The Congress had to scramble. They had to deal with this unexpected turn of events.
So, Napoleon's back. Did he try to take back control, undo everything the Congress had been working on?
He did. He marched on Paris, rallied his supporters, and briefly, he was back in power. It was a wild time. And, this actually had a significant impact on the Congress.
In what way? Did it derail their plans completely?
It didn't derail them, but it definitely added a sense of urgency. They had to finalize their work quickly, solidify those alliances against this common enemy. Napoleon's return sort of forced their hand.
So it's like suddenly the clock is ticking, they need to get their act together.
Precisely. The Hundred Days' War ultimately led to Napoleon's final defeat at Waterloo, and of course his exile to St. Helena. But it's funny, amidst all this high-stakes diplomacy and political maneuvering, the Congress was also known for its lavish parties and social gatherings.
Right. It wasn't all work and no play. Our source material mentions the Congress being almost as famous for its balls and banquets as it was for its political dealings.
Yeah, there's a fair saying, le Congrès danse beaucoup, mais il ne marche pas, which means the Congress dances a lot, but it doesn't move forward. But there's actually a deeper meaning there.
What do you mean?
Well, while the Congress was busy waltzing and redrawing borders, they failed to address some pretty fundamental issues. They were so focused on restoring the old order that they overlooked the rising tide of nationalism and liberalism.
Right, those revolutionary ideas that Napoleon had been spreading, the ideas that the Congress was trying so hard to suppress.
Exactly. While they were busy celebrating their victory and restoring monarchs, those forces of change were brewing beneath the surface.
So in a way, they were creating a system that was already outdated, maybe even doomed to fail.
Yeah, you could say that. By trying to hold back the inevitable, they were setting the stage for future conflicts and revolutions.
It's fascinating how the very act of trying to create peace can sometimes sow the seeds of future conflict. It's a reminder that peace isn't just about treaties and borders, it's about addressing the underlying issues that can lead to conflict.
Exactly. And that's something we'll explore further when we come back. We'll delve deeper into the specific territorial changes that were made and examine how they shaped the map of Europe. Stay tuned.
We'll be right back. Welcome back, everyone. Before the break, we were talking about how the Congress of Vienna was trying to reshape Europe after Napoleon. And, they weren't messing around, right? They were actually redrawing maps, changing borders. It was a huge undertaking.
Yeah, no kidding. They were literally trying to create a Europe that would be less prone to war. And they really thought that by carefully adjusting territories, they could make that happen.
It's like they were playing a giant game of, what's that game? Risk. But with real countries.
Yeah, kind of, but with much higher stakes, obviously.
Yeah.
And every change, every little border adjustment had these huge implications, not just for the countries involved, but for the whole balance of power in Europe. It was a delicate balancing act.
Right. They were trying to juggle those three principles we talked about. Legitimacy, compensation, balance of power. Not an easy task, I imagine.
Not at all. So let's start with Russia. They were major players of the Congress, obviously. What did they get out of all of this?
Yeah, they had just beaten Napoleon. They were probably feeling pretty good about themselves.
Oh, yeah. They walked away with some pretty significant prizes, especially in Poland. They saw themselves as the liberators of Europe, and they felt, well, entitled to some spoils of war. So the Congress basically granted them control over this newly created Kingdom of Poland.
Well, Poland was technically its own thing, but under Russia's thumb.
Pretty much, yeah. While technically autonomous, it was heavily influenced by Russia. A strategic win for them, for sure. Expanded their sphere of influence westward.
Right. It's like they were playing the long game. Not just looking for immediate gains, but positioning themselves for the future.
Exactly. They had a vision for their role in Europe, and the Congress gave them a chance to advance that vision.
What about Prussia? They were also pretty eager to expand their territory. Did they manage to get what they wanted?
Well, they were another big winner. But their gains weren't without controversy. They acquired a sizable chunk of Saxony, which Austria wasn't too happy about, and they also got territories in the Rhineland.
Ah, so bolstering their defenses against any future French aggression.
Yeah.
Seems like everyone at the Congress had one eye on the past and one eye on the future.
Yeah, for sure. They were very aware of the conflicts that had plagued Europe for centuries, and they were, I think, genuinely determined to create a system that would prevent that from happening again.
Okay, but Austria, with their emphasis on tradition and, going back to the old ways, they couldn't have been happy about all these Prussian gains, right?
Not really, no. They saw Prussia's growing power as a potential threat. But they also knew they couldn't completely block their ambitions without risking another war. Nobody wanted that.
Right, so Austria was kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place.
Yeah, so they focused on securing their own gains elsewhere. They expanded their influence in northern Italy. Apparently, the Austrian emperor had a particular fondness for that region, according to our sources.
It's interesting how personal preferences, like the emperor liking Italy, could actually factor into these huge, high-level negotiations. It reminds us that even in these massive historical events, it's still people making the decisions.
It really is. History is ultimately a story about people, their motivations, their choices, big or small. It all contributes to how things turn out.
But let's not forget about France. They were the ones who lost the war. It's pretty amazing they didn't lose more territory.
Yeah, that's Talleyrand for you, the master diplomat. He somehow managed to play the other powers so well that France came out of it relatively unscathed. It's actually quite impressive.
It seems like every move at the Congress was this calculated gamble, trying to balance, their own interests with the need to maintain peace in Europe.
Yeah, a delicate dance. But it wasn't just about the major players, right? What about the smaller nations? How did they fare in all of this map redrawing?
That's a good question. It couldn't have been easy being a small country during all of this.
No, it wasn't. The Congress addressed the fate of several smaller nations. For example, Finland, which had been under Swedish control, was ceded to Russia.
So Finland goes to Russia, and what did Sweden get?
Well, in exchange, Sweden received Norway, which had been part of Denmark.
It's like a big game of musical chairs with countries.
Uh-huh. Yeah, kind of. They were trying to create a system that would minimize future conflicts. And sometimes that meant moving pieces around to, create more defensible borders or appease different powers.
Right, make everything fit together nicely.
Exactly. And they also recognized the independence of Switzerland, declaring it permanently neutral.
Switzerland, the land of neutrality and chocolate. Always a good idea.
Right. And then there's the Netherlands. They were caught in the middle of the Napoleonic Wars. The Congress decided to unite them with Belgium.
Creating a bigger, stronger state. I guess that makes sense.
Yeah, the idea was to have a stronger entity there in the north that could help contain any future French ambitions. Remember, they were always trying to prevent any one power from becoming too dominant.
It's clear they were obsessed with that balance of power. But was it all just about land grabs and strategic maneuvering? Did they address any other issues, like, the slave trade?
They did actually touch on a few other things. One notable example was their condemnation of the slave trade. They didn't abolish it outright. That would have been too radical for the time. But they did take a moral stance against it, which, paved the way for future abolitionist movements.
So they weren't completely indifferent to humanitarian concerns.
No, not entirely. It's important to remember that these events were driven by complex, sometimes even contradictory motives. The Congress wasn't all cold, hard politics. It was also a reflection of the values and beliefs of the time.
So it sounds like they were trying to strike a balance between pragmatism and idealism, addressing those immediate concerns about power and security, but also trying to make the world a slightly better place.
That's a good way to put it. They were trying to find that middle ground, reconcile competing interests, manage historical grievances, and, anticipate future challenges, all while dancing the waltz and attending fancy banquets, of course.
Right. We can't forget about the social side of it all. It's kind of wild to think about these powerful diplomats and monarchs, the same ones redrawing the map of Europe, also taking time to party and socialize. It reminds us that they were human, not just political chess pieces.
Exactly. It makes the whole thing more relatable, doesn't it? History isn't just about dates and treaties. It's about the people who lived through those times, their hopes and fears. And sometimes a grand ball can tell you just as much about an era as a political declaration.
Right. It's those human elements that bring history to life. But speaking of human elements, the Congress's attempt to create a stable Europe, it didn't really address those rising forces of nationalism and liberalism we talked about.
No, it didn't. And that's a big part of the story. While they were focused on restoring that old order, there were cracks appearing in their carefully constructed facade. And those cracks would eventually widen, leading to new challenges and conflicts down the road.
So maybe they were so busy trying to prevent war that they inadvertently set the stage for more of it. It's kind of a paradox, isn't it?
It is. And that's something we'll explore further when we come back. We'll step into the realm of what if and consider some counterfactuals. What might have happened if things had gone differently at the Congress of Vienna? Would Europe have been more peaceful? Would the map look totally different? We'll dive into all that after the break.
Welcome back. So we've spent this whole deep dive looking at the Congress of Vienna, this massive attempt to reshape Europe after Napoleon's defeat. But, for fun, let's play a little game of what if.
Counterfactuals. It's always interesting to think about those roads not taken, right?
Yeah.
How different choices could have led to, a completely different world.
Right. Let's put on our historian hats and really explore some possibilities. For example, what if Napoleon hadn't escaped from Elba? Do you think the Congress would have played out differently?
Oh, that's a great question. I mean, Napoleon's return really did light a fire under everyone, right? It created this sense of urgency.
Right, like we got to get this done, we got to get it done now.
Exactly. So without that pressure, maybe they would have taken more time, considered different arrangements, maybe been a bit more open to new ideas.
It's like they were so focused on putting out the fire that they didn't have time to think about, preventing future fires.
Yeah, that's a good analogy. But, here's a really interesting thought. What if they had actually listened to those calls for liberalism and nationalism? What if they tried to incorporate those ideas into their vision for Europe?
Now that would have been a radical shift. Imagine a Europe where, borders reflected cultural identities, where people had more of a say in their own government.
It's a fascinating thought experiment, isn't it? I mean, who knows? Maybe a Europe like that would have been more stable, less prone to those nationalistic conflicts that erupted later on.
It's tempting to think so, but it's impossible to know for sure. History doesn't really offer do-overs.
Right. But it does highlight this fundamental tension at the heart of the Congress. They were trying to create stability, but by clinging to the old order, an order that, well, many people felt didn't represent them.
It's like trying to hold back the tide, right? You can try, but eventually the water's going to come rushing in. Okay, so another what if. What if one of the major powers, say Prussia, had pushed even harder for a unified German state? How do you think that would have impacted the balance of power?
Ooh, now that would have been a game changer. I mean, Austria would have gone ballistic, and France, well, they definitely wouldn't have been happy about having such a powerful neighbor on their border.
It could have sparked another war right there at the Congress.
It's entirely possible. It really shows how fragile peace can be, right? How even the smallest change can have huge ripple effects.
Like a butterfly effect. One flap of a wing in one place can cause a hurricane on the other side of the world. But, okay, let's bring it back to the Congress of Vienna. What do you think is the biggest takeaway for our listeners?
I think the most important thing to remember is that the Congress, despite all its flaws and limitations, it really was a genuine attempt to create lasting peace. After, decades of war and upheaval.
It was a huge step forward, a bold experiment in diplomacy.
Exactly. And I think it shows us that even when things seem really, really difficult, cooperation and dialogue are still possible.
That's a powerful message, and I think it's something we can all learn from, right? Peace isn't just something that happens. We have to work for it. We have to talk to each other, understand different perspectives, and find ways to bridge those divides.
Well said. And, I really hope our listeners will continue to explore this fascinating period in history. There's so much to learn from it.
Absolutely. The Congress of Vienna might seem like a long time ago, but its legacy is still with us today. It reminds us that the choices we make, the actions we take, they can have ripple effects that extend far beyond our own time.
It's all interconnected.
Exactly. So keep questioning, keep learning, and of course, keep diving deep. Thanks for joining us.